Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm the CEO of Collapse Survivor, and this was our 9th simulation covering the Chinese and Iranian terrorist attacks on U.S. infrastructure targets and civilian terror attacks.
And I'm Larry. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer for the Collapse Survivor app.
And I'm Drew Miller. I'm CEO of Fortitude Ranch and a survival consultant expert for the Collapse Survivor app.
So in this simulation, there were terrorist attacks on key U.S. infrastructure during the 6-day simulation, including municipal water systems, dams, bridges, and some forest fire and IED attacks. So today we're going to review some of the survival lessons learned and talk about alternative water solutions.
So we did a survey back in fall 2023 of preppers, and we asked several hundred preppers, what do you think is the greatest threat that we face? And number 5 was terrorist attacks facilitated by our largely open border. And in this specific scenario, that's what we had. Chinese agents and Iranian Revolutionary Guards terrorists carried out the attacks.
And we essentially rate the collapses in our simulations on a 5-point scale. 1 is normal. It's peacetime. Up through minor unrest situations and minor collapses to a level 5, which is a really disastrous long-term collapse with high percentage of the population dying. This was a level 2, not a severe collapse. There was a high level of concern and panic, but the terrorist attacks were relatively small in number and scope. There was more terrorism to frighten than the actual level of violence that would paralyze the U.S. and lead to a really bad collapse.
So the U.S. Border Patrol authorities, they detained more than 24,000 Chinese citizens crossing the southern border in 2023, that fiscal year, which was nearly 13 times more than what was recorded in any previous years before that. And the FBI warned officially that Chinese safe houses were basically in every state in our country. The U.S.-Mexico border, it remains open to whatever government agents or terrorists or even cartel gang members if they choose to enter. Illegal border crossings in Southern California include a record number of Chinese nationals coming in with fake IDs, really good IDs, by the way, that are then discarded at the border. This was the motivation basically for this scenario of Chinese agents attacking the infrastructure in the United States.
And so in this exercise message where Dr. Phil was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the surge in Chinese people, many of them men, military age, was not something fabricated. Like a lot of the stuff you see in our simulations, it was real world stuff, often with no changes made to fit our scenario.
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's a branch of the Iranian armed forces that is basically, it's their most radically committed religious zealots, people willing and eager to die for what they're fighting for, which is Islam. And there are forces that are either directly or through other terrorist groups that have attacked and killed Americans every year over the past several decades. They're also the most elite unit, well-equipped Iranian soldiers, about 250,000 of them or so. They mainly work indirectly to kill Americans overseas via other Islamic terrorist groups. But in this scenario, they actually infiltrated into the United States where they carried out terrorist attacks inside our borders.
In this exercise simulation, after the foreign agents and the terrorists started causing damage, police were overwhelmed trying to protect and guard infrastructure, and the gangs realized that with police overwhelmed, they had good opportunities to steal, and their attacks ratcheted up. There are at least 1 million gang members in the U.S. that we know about, possibly a lot more that are unknown, and they're a worldwide phenomenon, and probably always will be. Whenever a collapse occurs, you need to be prepared for home invasions and carjackings and all kinds of violent crime. As people starve to death, good people will also start stealing food. But the gangs are the bigger threat because many of them, gangs like MS-13, lots of really bad Chicago and other big city gangs, are extremely violent. Some of them will kill just for the fun of it or to improve their image. My recommendation is that during a collapse, you treat every intruder as potentially a ruthless gang member and shoot to kill. In this scenario, MS-13 started kidnapping as an additional easy way to make money. Since this was not a full breakdown of our economy, money was still valuable. And if you travel to a lot of Latin American countries today, there are areas where a rich foreigner is at a big risk of being kidnapped, and we should expect that this threat will be much worse in a collapse.
And so in this scenario, there was no starvation, nor were there any normal people marauding at scale in this scenario. The marauding was done by criminally inclined people who will loot and maraud anytime the police are overwhelmed. Some of this was highlighted in the scenario as this message traffic item indicated.
So in big cities, especially, whenever you've got a disaster happening, there's, the perception that the police are going to be tied up actually with disaster recovery or some type of crowd control. And so you should expect that gangs and criminals, they will take advantage of that with a limited police response capability. So our water systems in this country, they're huge, which means there are many points of vulnerability where you can either attack them to disable them or inject a poison. Right now, it's not feasible to poison a big water reservoir, but with artificial intelligence used to develop new, more lethal, smaller volumes of poisons, that could be a threat in our very near future, making it even more difficult, impossible actually, to protect our water supplies. In this scenario, water systems were attacked, but largely for the terror and the fear benefit that would be generated. China and Iran have jointly decided to pursue these attacks in this scenario, though they operated independently, and their main goal was to terrorize U.S. citizens, probably trying to persuade the U.S. to back away from its foreign involvement and commitments and focus more on its homeland security.
Dams are another really vulnerable part of U.S. infrastructure and likely terrorist targets. In this scenario, there was an attack on Hoover Dam, which is a vital hydroelectric resource as well as a huge dam. But this attack was anticipated and was defeated.
So other attacks, other targets that were actually attacked in this scenario included bridges, refineries, forest fires were started, and unless you mobilized all of the guard units and added federal troops to that guard duty, it would be impossible to guard all the infrastructure targets that would be available to the enemy agents and terrorists as they go about trying to commit more attacks. If there is a target that an enemy really wants to get after, they can probably take it out.
So this is a fairly simple scenario and a low level of collapse threat, as we mentioned, but there's some important, fairly obvious survival lessons that are summarized here. You should always assume that municipal water supplies will be disabled, if not by loss of the electric grid. In this case, it was poisoning going on. As a prepper, you should really operate under the assumption that all critical infrastructure can be taken down. If you live downstream from a dam, you want to find out how high the water would be if it ever got destroyed and avoid the path or have a plan to quickly get out if that happens, and maybe store key supplies up higher where they can survive a dam break. Before you buy a house or get a bug out location especially, look at the area from the perspective of an enemy or a terrorist. If there's anything they'd want to blow up or start on fire, be far enough away from that you can avoid the collateral damage. Forest fires are a constant threat, especially in the West. And if you're near one, you should have a really great fire breaks around your house and buildings and build as fireproof as possible. Finally, if terrorists are trying to terrorize by killing people with IEDs, as we had in this scenario, you don't want to go to crowded places like shopping malls or transportation hubs that could be targets. Or if you must, you want to get through them as fast as possible.
In this scenario and several others we've ran, militia groups were deputized to assist police or state National Guard forces. There are a lot of different types of militia groups, as you see in this slide.
Many states have official militias. These are not National Guard forces, which are federally funded and could be mobilized for federal service, but controlled directly by the state. There's also a lot of private militia groups. Some are big national ones, like the Oath Keepers, and there's hundreds of small militia groups, perhaps even thousands, because they're not normally try to keep fairly confidential. At Fortitude Ranch, we emphasize that we are not a militia force because there's a lot of left-leaning media which often portrays militia as right-wing bad guys, and because some militia groups do have a mission of taking offensive action like patrolling borders, and Fortitude Ranch is strictly defensive. We defend our property and stay on our property. We think it's very wrong to portray militia groups as right-wing or bad. They're overwhelmingly good people, and they recognize the threat of marauders and looters in a collapse and the vital need for collective defense in a collapse survival situation. Unless you've got a small group of people, you can't keep enough guards on duty on watch 24/7, and you can be vulnerable to a marauder attack. I think you probably need at least 50 plus armed people in a collapse situation. So if you join a group like Oath Keepers, you're probably going to put yourself in a position where you're on some government watch list. And I'm not going to try to prove this, but I do think it's a risk that you would take. The bigger consideration you need to make about joining a militia group is the overall impact on your survival plans and prospects. If joining means that you're now going to be called to go on out and do patrols or work away from your family, that may be a risk. But if that militia offers you protection, it could be a life-saving blessing. It's a decision you've got to make.
There was a message item in the scenario about fallout from nuclear attack. How widespread would it be? This concern was raised because the Chinese agents attacking the U.S. seems like it would be a prelude to an invasion of Taiwan and the risk of nuclear exchange with China. So, Drew, would it disperse everywhere and lead to the fallout problems for everyone?
In general, the answer to that is no. Fallout tends to be, more concentrated. This diagram you're looking at here is the fallout from contamination from plutonium fires that did actually take place at Rocky Flats, which is a former U.S. nuclear weapons production facility north of Denver. And the prevailing winds from that plant carried that airborne contamination south and east into populated areas northwest of Denver. The closer you are to ground zero, where the nuclear weapon explodes or a nuclear plant has a radioactive release, the worse off you are, obviously. And ground zero is usually going to be very high levels of radiation, very lethal. Immediately downwind, you can also get high levels of fallout depending on the winds. If it's a gentle breeze, you'll get most of it. If it's a high wind and changing direction a lot, it'll spread over a much wider area. But that means, although the risk of contamination is larger, the levels of radioactivity are much lower.
In general, you don't want to be near a good target, especially a good target for a nuclear weapon or a nuclear power plant. And if you are in the direction of prevailing winds, you want to be either further away, ideally 50 or more miles.
But radioactive fallout can be dealt with if you do have it. It's not a death sentence. You can wear masks and gloves and shovel up the fallout and cart it off. And you can sandbag and stay underground if remediation is not an option. In some other briefings, we cover use of radiation detectors and the health impacts of different level of exposures. So our deep dive topic today is water sources, because water was targeted as part of the infrastructure in this. Of course, if the grid goes down, that means no municipal water systems because they require electric power for the water pumps. If water is poisoned, as happened in this scenario, or it might be poison and you're just not sure about it, you have to have alternative sources of waters. And if you're planning to bug out, you may have, a short few hours to drive, but the car may break down or something may force you to go out on foot. So you need to have an in-transit water supply. So we're really talking about two separate water situations to worry about. The one in transit and then the long-term one when you get where you want to be to ride out the collapse. For getting home, if you're far away to your bug out location, if you've got a rural place or survival community like Fortitude Ranch you're going to, for most it's a fairly simple matter of some water bottles. But to have a little bit more preparation in case you've got some long delay, having a life straw, which is basically a small portable water filtration device, is a really good idea. A lot of people have that in their bug out bags. Or you can store and you can use water purification tablets. Water in our home or bug out location is the big long-term need. You may start with the municipal water system working, and if you've got it at the start, you want to fill up every conceivable water container you can, bathtubs, buckets, all you can find. Wells, of course, are the best, but it's amazing how many people, and preppers I'm counting here too, overlook the need for the power system to use that well pump. And a small solar system generally is not going to work. First of all, most water pumps are 240 volts. Most small solar systems are just 115 volts. Now, you can buy a converter to get that up to 240 volts, but the problem is the amperage. Most water pumps take a lot of amperage, and especially the initial startup surge, you need a more substantial amount of power than a lot of small solar systems will have. At Fortitude Ranch, what we do when we put in wells is we specify 115 volt pumps, but that's not the norm. And we've often found that, we've got to really push the well installers to do that because they generally don't stockpile them or carry them. If you've got a propane generator, and again, we've got that at Fortitude Ranch, that's a little bit different. That doesn't tend to be a lot of bigger power, and a lot of those have 240 volts. But here, the key thing is, well, you've got to have a big propane tank and make sure you keep it, near full all the time. And then in a collapse, you got to be a power Nazi, making sure that propane is not wasted for heating or cooking or water heaters. You want to save it for your propane generator, so you've got your well pump, and at times when you really need electricity, you've got it. Now, even if you've got a working well pump power, you've got to assume the worst. And the first of our 3 principles at Fortitude Ranch is respect Murphy's Law. Assume that whatever you've got is going to break. So you should have a manual well pump as well. And we like the simple pump. We use that a lot at Fortitude Ranch.
What are your other 2 principles?
So our 3 core principles are 1, respect Murphy's Law. Number 2, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And the third one is adapt. And a lot of us are military. That's kind of a basic military thing. You just have to assume that things are going to go bad that you didn't anticipate, and you have to adapt. And now the other long-term water sources are to collect it off your roof. So it's nice to have a big bucket or barrel set up to collect roof water. Stored water tanks and cisterns are also nice. If you're going to collect water off the roof or from a questionable cleanliness source, you need a water filter like the Berkey, and of course, stockpiling the replacement filters. And finally, water nearby. Ideally, you've got a year-round source of stream water or a lake that doesn't run dry. Here you're talking, rural locations. Even if you're in a city or suburb where there's a lake or a creek running by, that's not going to be feasible in a collapse because of the marauder threat. If you're going out regularly to get water, they're going to know that, and you're going to probably end up being an ambush target. The last thing we list there are solar sills. And on our new Collapse Survivor website, there's a diagram in there on how to build them. You can buy them, you can build them. They're fairly simple. But a solar spill can take even polluted water and turn it into absolutely safe drinking water. And this is also very important to talk about, which is how much water do you really need in a survival situation? For personal human needs, you need to ignore the standard consumption rates and uses of water. They're nonsense in a collapse situation. You're not running a dishwashing machine, a disposal. You're probably manually washing your clothes. So you can actually get by with about a gallon of water a day for drinking and cooking. More is obviously nicer, but that level can keep you alive. Other water survival needs are there, and these are probably bigger ones for gardening and maybe ranch animals. Your chickens, if they free range, can probably get most of their water on their own, but parts of the year not. And of course, if you got sheep, cattle, you've got to have a supply. Gardening is vital for long-term survival. So unless you're in a place that has reliable rainfall all growing season, you're going to have to be pumping or toting water for your crops. Washing your body and your clothes, it's frankly optional in a bad collapse, and you can do that with very little water. And remember, if you've got that solar still, that washing water is now drinking water once you run it through the still. These water uses are highly variable based on your location, climate, your plans, and your preferences. So take the time to figure it out, especially if you're in a tight water situation. Ideally, you've got multiple water sources And that's a requirement at our Fortune Ranch locations. And you don't want to waste water, but you like to have the situation where you've got plenty to meet your needs.
So then if you have questions about how to make a still, we have that information. That information is going to be on our website. We just did an update and wanted to make a difference with a different website than most prepper websites, because they're cluttered with advertisements and very limited amounts of useful information. Our website has a detailed index and professional presentation about how to prepare and survive, with a knowledge base where we have all that information, with PDF reports and videos on all the key topics. It's information selected, reviewed, and approved by experts.
So it's really most important that it's well organized, that information. So if you pick a topic that you're interested in, like best survival food to garden, you can quickly find that best and really accurate information here on the website.
And so if you're a regular Collapse Survivor podcast lessons learned watcher, you know that we end with a bit of prepper humor.
These are definitely two I like.
We mentioned before that, one of the reasons we think humor is a topic to have is that, based on our military experience, we know that during stressful times, humor is really valuable for relieving stress. And this poster I want to show you on the next slide was all over Iraq when I was there on one of my tours as a consultant, not in uniform. And I thought it was just hilarious. They took, and I want to explain it before I show it to you, they took a World War II poster that was designed to encourage American citizens to drink less coffee and save it for our troops. And this is what the Army changed the caption to over in Iraq. Apparently someone had said something so stupid that this poster was produced and posted everywhere around the headquarters I was at in Iraq to remind folks to think before you say something stupid.
Which, besides being good advice, that's great prepper advice. And it kind of brings something for you to think about. Take a minute to think. Catch your breath and think.
I second that for sure. All right, so if you have any better prepper jokes or just good prepper jokes in general, send it to us at contact@collapsesurvivor.com.
Just to remind you, keep your Collapse Survivor app on your phone, even if you don't want to play the simulation. But that way you get real world, potentially life-saving threat alerts when a virus starts spreading, big solar flares that may take down the electric grid, or some other disaster is likely taking place or starting. The sooner you know, the more time you have to get to a safe place, and that raises your odds for survival. This app costs just $10 a year. Encourage everyone, not just those you care about, to have this app on their phone. Whether they want to use the training simulations or not, that's up to them to choose. It's all about preparedness, the features that are involved in it, and the threat alerts. The sooner you get them, they can definitely save your life.
Awesome. So that concludes our coverage of the scenario. If you have any ideas for an interesting, realistic collapse scenario or any good prepper training material, please send them to us. And as a reminder, you will be emailed a short PDF report on lessons learned from this simulation tomorrow for those who have played the live simulation this past week. For those playing this simulation later from the archive scenarios or watching this podcast later, you can find the lessons learned report on the Collapse Survivor website, collapsesurvivor.com. And until our next Collapse Survivor training exercise simulation, this is Ryan signing off.
This is Larry signing off.
And Drew saying, prepare for the worst, enjoy the present.